Hey, hey. So here I am. I hope I can be heard and that everything is working fine on the system. I'm going to talk about my article that came out yesterday in the New York Times. Trump has disqualified himself from running in 2020, is the title. There it is. And I want to respond to a few criticisms that I've heard and draw out a few points that I think aren't being uh, as well appreciated as they ought to be. Um, um, I scheduled this at 3:50 on YouTube, so I'll just kind of dither for 2 minutes until I get until that starts going live. But I'll start by just talking about the impetus for this article. One thing that I feel like wasn't being said in the way it needs to be said um, is that you just can't expect um, there to be a fair election when somebody in it has already shown that they're trying to break the rules so that it's not fair. I think this is a really simple point, and it just kind of follows from very basic, middle school civics class principles. Uh, and I want to just kind of get that clear first, um, and then try to draw out exactly how crazy what Trump is doing really is, and 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 emphasize that what he's trying to do, this conspiracy theory that he's trying to sell, um, is premised on the same logic uh, that implies that he shouldn't be allowed to run. Right? He's accepting that logic when he's trying to invert the whole story and turn it around on the Democrats who are running against him and who are investigating him. All right. Uh, YouTube is not getting the stream for some reason. Um, so if you're waiting at YouTube, I'm sorry. Um, just uh, uh, go to Twitch or watch on Periscope. I don't know why this keeps happening to me. Um, all right. So here's how it is. So the argument that I make at the Times um, is that what Trump has been caught doing, the way that he has been caught red-handed, trying to exert pressure on the president of Ukraine to dig up dirt on his most feared political rival, shows that he has no intention of running a fair election, that he's going to do whatever he can to try to rig it in his favor. And that includes, clearly, given what's going on now, getting foreign interference in the election once again. So what I say is, if he's willing to cop to this, I mean, he says, keeps saying that it's been, it's a perfect conversation. There's no problem here about arbitrarily suspending duly appropriated congressional funds to Ukraine that is specifically intended to help them stave off Russia's imperial ambitions. So there's nothing wrong with it, just like holding that up for no specific reason, and then giving the president of Ukraine a call in which he says, hey, we'd really like to get those weapons, and you say, oh, well, that's great. I don't think there's, we've done a lot for you. That hasn't been so much reciprocity, though. So do me a favor. Look into this stuff about Joe Biden. All right. By itself, I think a lot of people who aren't already in the bag for the president see that as, more than enough of a worry. And what I say is that, if Trump's willing to admit to all this, which he has, he just says there's no problem with it, all while promoting a conspiracy theory to justify it, then the American voting public can very reasonably suspect that he's abusing the powers of his office in other ways as well. All right. I'm an idiot who keeps showing you my desktop. So, the point of that is that, Trump is giving American voters a, totally cut and dried reason to doubt that any election that he participates in can be fair. And that's why I think that, if the House impeaches and the Senate is duty bound to convict him and remove him from office. Right? And in the piece, I go through a couple scenarios about what can happen if that doesn't occur. So if he is impeached, if during this investigation, all of these facts come out about Trump's specific attempts to get other countries to interfere in the election, and all the contours of this conspiracy theory that he's selling become clear, and I'm going to get more into that because it's important. And what that conspiracy theory is, what the upshot of it is that in fact the Democrats are the ones who are guilty of interfering in the election in 2016 in cahoots with foreign power. That the entire Mueller investigation is just a continuation of this completely illegal violation of America's democratic sovereignty, and that the ongoing impeachment investigation is itself an attempt to undermine American democracy, right? So I'll go deeper into that and how outrageous and crazy it is. But if all of that comes out, and it becomes clear that that Trump has no interest whatsoever in a minimally adequate democratic election that is not, as they say, free and fair, but the Senate acquits him anyway. American voters will have no reason to accept his election in case he is reelected, right? Like and this could cause huge problems. And to understand the basis of the problems, it's important to just grasp the very basic civics lesson logic at work here. Right? So it's just this. I mean, it's very, 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 very simple. America is a constitutional republic, and the entire idea at the root of the American founding is that political authority is legitimate just in case it is duly delegated from the population who is being governed. Right? Like that's the idea. The idea is that all political power, all political authority rests with the people, and that any political power that is wielded is authorized only insofar as it's been delegated by the people. The Constitution sets up a framework in which the method or the mechanism of the delegation of popular authority flows through elections, right? And there's a bunch of rules, there's a bunch of laws, right? So there are these rules that govern elections, and all of those rules are setting out the conditions under which the delegation of popular authority can actually be legitimately made, right? Like, so if power goes from the people to elected representatives, it's that transfer is legit, it's valid, only if the rules that govern that process are adhered to, right? That's the idea. And that's just the idea of America. So obviously, like, if those rules are violated in a systematic way, then there is no legal transfer of power, right? But if power is taken anyway, it's effectively a coup. It's illegitimate. That power cannot be legitimately exercised because the rules that have to be followed in order for it to be legitimately transferred haven't been followed. So there's no transfer. There's no transfer of power. It remains with people. It doesn't go to anybody. Or it goes in the way that the rules say that it goes. And so, like, obviously the idea of democratic sovereignty is that the results of elections are supposed to reflect the will of eligible voters in a democratic election, and not the influence of hostile foreign powers working, in cahoots with some political candidate or political party. Now, you can see what the issue is with Trump. Then, here's what do we already know about him, right? Well, we know from the consensus of Donald Trump's own government apparatus that Russia actively interfered in the 2016 election to try to help Donald Trump. Right? That is the consensus of the federal law enforcement and intelligence. That's reflected in Robert Mueller's investigation and report. He lays it out really, really clearly. And what that means is that there is some question about whether Donald Trump was legitimately elected in the first place. Right? It's not clear. The Mueller report, what it shows us is that there's this Russian interference that went on. The Trump campaign actively invited Russian interference. But Mueller was unable to establish a criminal conspiracy between the Russians and the Trump campaign, in part because Trump actively obstructed the investigation, right? And so Trump is guilty of it looked like at least 8 counts of criminal obstruction of justice, but he just could not be indicted, according to Mueller, because of the prevailing Department of Justice policy guidance around not indicting sitting presidents. So the guy's on the hook. The second he's out of office, he could be criminally indicted, right? He's got a big worry there. Plus, he's just comprehensively corrupt. And Mueller just kind of uncovered the tip of a incredible, submerged iceberg of criminal enterprises. And that speaks to his, desperation to make sure that his tax returns don't get out, or that these materials from Deutsche Bank don't get out. But the overall picture is that, Russians interfered with the election to help throw it to Trump. Trump invited that interference. Maybe did, maybe didn't collude with the Russians. It's hard to say, because he did, in fact, criminally obstruct the investigation. Okay. That's all extremely problematic, and clearly sufficient, more than sufficient grounds for impeachment. It really does call into question whether he legitimately won the election. And his willingness to engage in that kind of rule breaking around the democratic process, a process that has to maintain integrity for political authority to be legitimately exercised, completely suggests that he has no interest in protecting and defending the system of government that is laid out in the Constitution of the United States. All right. So what is it that Trump is doing with respect to his requests to President Zelensky of Ukraine and now a bunch of other world leaders? What is he doing when he has the Attorney General Bill Barr, the Secretary of State Pompeo, trotting around the globe, trying to investigate the roots of the Mueller investigation, dig up dirt on Joe Biden, on Joe Biden's son? Like, what's the point of that? The point of it is that he's trying to create a parallel reality, which is a kind of mirror image of the truth about him, right? So the idea is that the whole idea of Russian election interference is just a fraud. It's fake. Never happened, right? Never happened at all. The entire intelligence community, American federal law enforcement, they are all wrong. They got snookered, because the story of Russian election interference is actually completely fabricated. And who fabricated it? Who sold it? Who seeded all these crazy little facts everywhere, so that when the FBI and the CIA and the Department of National all of these really savvy investigators, what were they actually discovering? Oh, they're just discovering the sort of fraudulent facts that were planted by Ukrainians, and then it's just so crazy. And then so the whole idea, the whole idea of Russian election interference is made up. That the whole idea of it is a conspiracy theory. But the conspiracy theory isn't just Ukrainians; it's Ukrainians in a criminal conspiracy with the Democratic Party. Barack Obama, the Hillary Clinton campaign, Joe Biden, they're all conspiring with this foreign power to interfere in the election, in part by telling this made-up story about Russian interference in Donald Trump. They're doing all of that to throw it to Hillary Clinton, right? It's exactly what he did basically. Except it didn't work, right? Like it didn't work. Like Trump's so freaking popular, he just still just like barreled through and was able to take the election. But they weren't done. The Democrats weren't done, right? They wouldn't give up this conspiracy theory about Ukrainian democratic election interference. So they kept working the deep state to gin up these charges. And which led to the Mueller investigation. But the Mueller investigation is just the continuation of democratic Ukrainian attempts to undermine America's democratic sovereignty. Right? Well, but what does that mean? Right? Well, if that's true, then that whole thing, this whole investigation, they're still coming after our democracy. They still want to overturn the will of the people. If they get their way, they will wreck our constitutional Republican system, right? Because the point of the system is to have elections in which the will of the people is transferred to elected representatives through valid, free and fair, unrigged, uninterfered with democratic elections. So if that's the case, right, then the investigation is an existential threat to the constitutional order of the United States of America. And so Donald Trump is duty bound by his oath of office to impede this investigation in any way possible, right? Like that is his absolute patriotic duty. He's got to do it, right? So this turns his obstruction of justice charges into the fact that he obstructed justice flips into patriotic heroism, right? Maybe I broke the law in some sense, but this entire investigation is completely illegitimate. And I had to do this to save the Republic from the depredations of Joe Biden and the Ukrainians. All right? So that's the idea, right? So if your model of Donald Trump is that he is a just world historical criminal who has been able to evade legal accountability for decades of just absolutely astonishing crime, and just kind of beat the rap all the way into the White House. I mean, it's a great story. It's one of the greatest, craziest stories ever. But like, if that's your model of him, and that the reason that he ran for president was in some sense to politicize any attempt to hold him legally accountable for money laundering, tax evasion, all of the manifold infractions for which he is ultimately guilty. That the value of the presidency is the kind of legal immunity that he has, right? And he knows that he's in deep water, and the worst thing that can happen to him is losing the impunity that the presidency of the United States affords him. So he's going to do anything, right? And the nice ninja trick here is this crazy inversion. So he's turning the investigation, the fact of Russian interference, the fact of his probable collusion, his obstruction of justice. He's turning all of that into evidence of his unimpeachable heroic patriotism in defense of American democracy, right? And so when you look at the substance of his asks to President Zelensky, right? Like, he only asked for two things. One thing, some CrowdStrike server that's supposed to be in the Ukraine, right? Like, why would it be in the Ukraine? Like, CrowdStrike is an American sort of information security firm. Um, they don't like. There's no investigation that requires some physical server. Um, the way it works is just the way it works is just that investigators come in and basically make copies of the server. They make copies of everything in the server that contains information. They just mirror it all or something. I'm no internet guy, but but it doesn't make any sense, right? But it's part of this conspiracy theory. So the idea that there's this thing in Ukraine is part of this idea that this firm that was associated with the Democratic National Committee's sort of like information security, that they are somehow tied up with Ukrainians and are part of the nefarious conspiracy to make up a fake story about Russian election interference and attach Donald Trump to it, right? Like, so if you were acting like that were true, you would, go around to all these different countries and say, like, I want you to look for evidence of this thing. And by strong arming them into investigating it, the fact that they are investigating it gives it a certain kind of credence that it couldn't possibly have before, right? Then what he asked for is like dig up this dirt on Joe Biden, and like again the point of that it's the same kind of inversion. Trump clearly sees Biden as the Democratic candidate who is most threatened, who most threatens his precious, the thing he covets most, which is the immunity of the office of the presidency. Right, like so, it would be bad news for him if he loses an election. This is the guy he thinks is most likely to be able to beat him. It's also super convenient that he was the vice president under Obama, and the fact that Biden was in fact involved in trying to push out a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor. Has this nice mirroring effect that he really likes. Like like Trump loves, basically his favorite form of argument is I'm rubber and you're glue, and so the symmetry, the plausibility of an analogy there, he's just going to force into an analogy, right? Like so the problem with this prosecutor in Ukraine was that he was not investigating anything. There was a huge amount of corruption going on. There's all these oligarchs, some of them attached to Russia, some of them attached to Putin, all just like interfering in the political process. The whole thing is corrupt. The prosecutor's supposed to be rooting that out, but he's doing nothing whatsoever, right? So he's supposed to be, investigating the company that Biden's shady son has a seat on the board of, but he's not investigating it, right? Like, because he's protecting basically the interests of all these companies, because the way it works is it seems to be like kind of a shakedown racket, right? You open an investigation, you get paid off, then you don't do anything, then you close it, right? And Ukraine was in this, conflict that it's still in, with Russia. Like Russia, had taken a chunk of it and was trying to take more. And this kind of corruption in Ukraine was hampering its ability to robustly defend itself against sort of Russian incursion. And so it was important to all of the EU states, all of the Baltic states who worry about that kind of, metastasizing, slow creep of Russian power and influence into European territories. All of those places wanted this guy to go, so that there could be some cleanup of this corruption that would allow their government to function in a normal way and resist Russia, right? Like so Biden was like, yeah, we're gonna hold up this USAID money until they get rid of this guy, and then they get rid of this guy. But he was just part of this huge multilateral effort to kind of push that that crooked prosecutor out and try to help clean up Ukraine. His son is a shady guy who is clearly cashing in on the fact that his dad is vice president. That's bad. I don't like that stuff going on in in the system, but it's not illegal. Maybe it's a problem that it's not illegal, but like he didn't do anything that was gonna help his son at all. So anyway, but the idea is that like what you're saying that I did is what he did, right? And so and he's kind of all involved in that, right? Like so they're trying to make it out that the crooked prosecutor was actually this sort of like this bloodhound sniffing out corruption, and if he'd been allowed to stay in office, like he might have not only uncovered the rank corruption of the Biden family, but he might uncover the big conspiracy in which the Ukrainians had framed poor Vladimir Putin, and got somehow the entire intelligence apparatus of the United States of America to believe that he was interfering with the election when the man is a saint. He's innocent. Like Vlad is like he would never do anything like that, right? But like so you can't let this hard-nosed bloodhound of a Ukrainian prosecutor stay at his job because like he might sniff out the truth. So Biden had to get he had to get him out there, right? And so this whole story is it's a great double play. Like it exculpates Trump because it turns the entire Mueller investigation, all of his legal liability for obstruction of justice, turns it all around into the Democrats are trying to undermine the entire American system. This investigation was premised on this illegitimate story, the point of which was to break our system and install an illegitimate pretender in power, right? Like, that's great. And it centrally involved the guy who I think is most likely to beat me in the next election. So he's the real corrupt threat to democracy, and he shouldn't be, allowed to run for office, frankly, right? Like, and so I find the whole thing just astonishing. But notice that the effectiveness of Trump's conspiracy theory about there being a conspiracy theory to frame the Russians and him and steal our democracy, right? The whole force of that is that it's correct that if somebody did that, they have fundamentally undermined the American system and have to go, right? So what he's trying to do is somebody in the chat said it's a classic Putin disinformation. Like he's just trying to sow confusion, right? Like Trump's model, which is basically the Russian model, is that it's important that nobody has a clear sense of the facts, right? Because if you're doing bad shit, right? Like if you're crooked and authoritarian and thuggish, the truth about that isn't good for you. So you have to attack truth. You have to attack reality. You have to attack the idea that there's any sort of independent external world that you can check claims against. Right? So you have to, and the way you do that is you make up a story that seems to account for the same pattern of facts, just explains them in a different way, right? You do everything that you can to, pile the appearance of evidence for your story. You want to shore it up everywhere that you can, And that's what like trying to get all these world leaders to do investigations is about. It's not necessarily that they're gonna you know, fabricate evidence for Trump, but some of them might if he's got the right kind of leverage. You know, maybe Zelensky would because he needs him so bad. But the point is to get investigations going, and the fact that they're going trades on the credibility of these other governments. Like they wouldn't be investigating this if there wasn't something there. And so the very fact that there's an investigation going on creates some perception that the conspiracy theory that you're trying to sell has some warrant to it, right? And that turns the actual facts into just another narrative, right? You've got a narrative, the other side has a narrative. It's just a political disagreement about which one is true, right? Like, so, and there's no way to independently adjudicate it, right? It's just who do you trust more, right? Like, who are you going to trust? Which is also why Trump spends all of his time running down the media, running down the credibility and legitimacy of anybody who actually says true things about him, because it all comes down to who has public credibility when it's selling its narrative. And so if you just basically identify any bad facts about you as part of a partisan conspiracy to bring you and American democracy down, then you've gotten a long way, right? You're a long way home, right? Like, but this is such an enormous, like, so if you just believe the facts, as I do, that he tried to rig the election last time, that he was cooperating with the Russians at some level, that he tried to obstruct the investigation, like clearly he can't be trusted to hold office. But then you combine that with what he's doing, that he's specifically trying to basically abolish truth and replace it with a crazy story, and put all of the instruments of American power in the service of that story, simply to keep himself in office and out of jail. Like that is an outrage of the first order. And if all of that is true about him, if that's what he's doing, and it pretty clearly is what he's doing, then it's just absolute nonsense to say like, well, I mean, this is, there's a lot of disagreement and this is getting pretty heated, but let's just settle it at the ballot box, right? That makes no sense at all, right? Like the guy is giving you every shred of evidence that you would need that he is not going to let a fair election happen. He's going to characterize absolutely everything that his political rivals do as part of an illegitimate conspiracy to take down American democracy, right? Like, so you can't have an election in which the president of the United States is going to use all the power of the presidency and the executive branch of the American government to lie about all of his political rivals and to undermine any chance that they could possibly have to reveal the truth about him, right? Because that just makes it impossible for the American public to actually evaluate who they want to represent them, right? Like it violates so many of the rules that need to be followed in order to have the kind of election in which the popular will can, be used to delegate authority to Donald Trump or anybody. It's violating so many of those necessary conditions that there's simply no way that if he's allowed to run for office again, anybody could trust that his reelection could be legitimate, that there was in fact a legal transfer of popular authority from American voters to Donald Trump, right? There's no legitimate way forward for him now. And that in a very long-winded way is the argument of my piece. And Republicans need to grasp that and grasp the implications of it. Um, I think it's getting clearer and clearer as Trump's just absolutely melting down, uh, that he is just a completely nefarious, self-centered actor who is only interested in, lining his pockets and bailing himself out of trouble, and he's got nobody's interest in mind. He's going to violate the Constitution at every turn, whatever it takes to stay in power, to stay out of the who's cow, right? Like I think it's getting clearer and clearer to the American people, that is just the case. It's getting harder and harder to avoid. And his attempt to sell this conspiracy theory, in a lot of ways, just makes it even clearer, right? The people who aren't going to believe it see what an enormous violation of every democratic principle and every principle based in fidelity to the truth could possibly be, right? So like, I don't think this is really going to go well from him. I'm pretty sure he's going to get impeached by the House. And the Senate needs to really think about what happens then, right? Because if all of this information about all of this stuff comes out, the American public is more and more soured on him. A huge portion, way more than a majority of the American people come to believe that the guy has every intention to completely wreck the system to save his ass, right? But they acquit him, and he's allowed to run, and he wins. That is just chaos, right? Like there is no legitimacy to his victory. There can be no legitimacy to his claim to authority, and people will recognize that, and there'll be a million people in Washington D.C. trying to shut down the government. Trump is out there saying stuff about like, if you impeach me, there's going to be a civil war. I'm not saying civil war, but like, what would cause civil unrest is the clear violation, clear and systematic corruption of the democratic process to keep someone in power who has no entitlement whatsoever to power, right? Like, people do not take that lightly. And Americans, I think especially, would not take that lightly. And that's just a huge recipe for disaster, right? So Republicans in the Senate who, privately say that they would convict him, but my constituents just like him too much, right? Like if they think that really they should convict him and kick him out of office, but they're just afraid to do it because like their voters will punish them if they do, just really need to think about what could happen, right? They just have to think about it. Like, you don't want to lead to basically just chaos in America. We just have our system break down, have no, clean transfer of power. You could end up in some kind of civil war if factions start really contesting who gets to control the guns and all of the power, right? It can turn into a horror. So Senate Republicans need to be responsible and think about that. But at the same time, right, like everything I said applies to the election as well. Like, if all of this stuff comes out on Trump, people are souring on him. It's clear that he's trying to steal the election. He's already showed us that that's his intention. People are only going to think it's worse in a month after a bunch of hearings and so forth. And then the Senate acquits him. A lot of Republicans were really fond of the Arab Spring, which was this sort of these popular democratic uprisings against authoritarian regimes, right? All these places had rigged elections, but the people were starting to get so angry about the oppression and abuse that they were subject to by these corrupt, kleptocratic, authoritarian regimes, that just everybody and their dog turned out to vote, and it overrode the rigging that the dirty regime tried to do in the first place, and led to changes of regime. Like, it didn't necessarily work out for everybody, but like that could, I feel like that's sure to happen here, right? Like just acquitting Trump is probably the electorally stupidest thing that they could do, unless they intend to just rig it all the way down, like most sort of soft authoritarian kleptocratic regimes. Like what you try to, because the appearance of legitimacy is incredibly valuable, right? Like the function of legitimacy at a sort of political level is that when people think that the people in office who have power hold their authority legitimately, and that the legislation that they create, the rules that everybody is bound to live by, if everybody who is in that process merits being in that process, all the rules were followed, then those rules have a kind of legitimacy. They inherit the authority that the people have transferred to the government through their democratic elections, and people do in fact take that seriously. Like even if they don't like the law, they'll tend to follow it. And voluntary compliance is incredibly valuable, right? Like you can't actually use state coercion to get everybody to follow the law. It's just, you can't do it. You can't surveil people enough. You can't marshal that much coercion. You need some kind of broad shared conception of the legitimacy of state behavior. And this runs in a continuum. It's not black or white. So what like corrupt authoritarian kleptocratic regimes like to do is they like to rig elections lightly, so that they always win, but it still looks like the election was mostly clean, and that they really do have a popular mandate and therefore do have legitimate authority, because that makes having authority way cheaper. People will tend to follow the rules, not think that they have a right to rebel or to form an insurrection. And so that's how you do it, right? But that can be overwhelmed by this huge electoral uprising, which is what I think would happen if Trump were impeached, but then acquitted by the Senate. So like the only option in that case for Republicans, if that happens, is to rig it all the way down, and then people will notice that, and then you get the dynamic of Trump's illegitimacy should he win. It's just a huge problem. Like, it would clearly be an electoral coup. American democracy would be over. It was like we might never have a legitimate election again. Like, that's just disaster, right? So Senate Republicans just need to think their way down the game tree a little bit and see that there's not actually a good option for them that involves acquittal. Either they're complicit in the destruction of America's liberal democratic constitutional order, or they risk a massive electoral uprising that's going to sweep them out of power, and turn power over to Democrats for who knows how long, right? Republicans would be delegitimized and wounded for maybe decades. So if they think they ought to do it in private, they ought to just do it in public. And if the worry is that they'll be punished by their voters, maybe they'll be punished by their voters, but this is not actually that hard to explain. They can just explain why they have to do it, right? And that's not going to be great for them either. Some of them could lose power because disaffected Trump voters won't vote for them if they vote to convict. but that's what they have to do. I mean, like, unless they just want to be traitors who threaten the entire, basically threaten to end the United States of America, like, they got to do it. So anyway, that is my that's my spiel, with a lot of asides, but much more elaborated than can fit into a pithy New York Times op-ed. And I hope that is useful to some of you. I'm definitely going to be writing more about this because, I really think we're on the brink. This is a critical juncture in American history. I've been spending a lot of time in the sort of, how democracies fail kind of literature. And part of the problem is always that people don't take it seriously enough, right? And part of the reason they don't take it seriously enough is that people do get caught in this kind of partisan he said, she said. They become inured to corruption. There's a boy who cried wolf dynamic where everybody always says that this is the most important election in our lifetimes. And so like that kind of rhetoric just starts to seem like it's hyperbole. But that is part of the dynamic, right? Like that one of the reasons why democracies fall apart is that people just can't take it seriously, that it's really happening. But I think we actually are on the brink that Trump, if he can, will wreck America, will wreck our constitutional system, will violate the law in every single way, will smear and delegitimize any political opposition to try to stay in power. And if he succeeds, things really are kind of over in a way. Like this, we won't have the system that we're supposed to have. We won't have a legitimate system at all. So people really need to take it seriously. I understand that it sounds like hysterical. It sounds like crazy. But this isn't a partisan point. It's not partisan at all. I don't care which party ends up winning majorities in Congress or winning the White House nearly as much as I care that we have a process that actually assigns political power in a legitimate way, in a way that prevents it from being abused, that prevents it from being turned back against the people that it's supposed to be working on the behalf of. So I've got to take my kid to piano lessons in a few minutes, so I got to check out. Hope you enjoyed it. Please read the piece and stay tuned. Thanks.